Our speaker tonight is Judith Orr, who is a leading member of the Socialist Workers' Party. She is an author of some books, which you can see here, Marxism and Women's Liberation, and also Sexism and the System. And also she's got a forthcoming book coming up, which is called Abortion Wars, The Fight for Reproductive Rights. And there's a special offer at Marxism for a 20% pre-order discount, and there'll be leaflets knocking around for you to do that. So would warmly urge you to get armed for that. And if you've read Judith's ISJ article on the same issue, you'll know how good a book it's going to be. Okay, without further ado, as they say, we'll start the meeting. Judith's going to speak for 35 minutes to introduce the topic, and then we're going to go into a discussion. And what we decided to do is to use speakers' slips. So there'll be members of the team, who are the people in the red T-shirts, will come round and they will be wafting slips. If you want to speak or you just want to ask a question, or if you're too shy to come and ask a question yourself and you want me to read it out for you, you can do all those things by using a speaker's slip. And then when we start the discussion, I'll give people 3 minutes each, and we'll try to keep it fairly tight so that we can get as many people in as possible. So Judith will now start her talk, so hopefully it'll be interesting.
She was doing so well just until that last comment, wasn't she?
Sorry, I'm going.
I'll try my best. That's okay. Well, it's been an extraordinary first 6 months of 2017, and we'll be talking about many aspects of that at Marxism. But tonight we're going to be talking in particular about the struggle for women's rights. And the year opened with the most enormous demonstrations for women's rights right across the globe. Here in Britain, only in the last 10 days, a woman's right to choose became a central issue in British politics. First with the disgusting deal that Theresa May did with the bigots of the DUP from Northern Ireland, which I've still got a trace of the accent left to show you I was born and grew up there. And then with a massive U-turn on the question of women from Northern Ireland, where they're barred from having abortion, having the right to get an abortion on the National Health Service in Britain. And Theresa May was so terrified about losing a vote on the day of the Queen's speech that she turned around and let that happen, allowed that to happen. This was something they had fought for 50 years since the 1967 Abortion Act. They didn't want it. Only 2 weeks ago, a Supreme Court case fought by Jeremy Hunt was to deny women the right to have access to NHS abortions. So this was something they didn't want, but it was something they had to give way. I have to say, Stella Creasy, the Labour MP, the right-wing Labour MP, is getting all the credit for this. I'm glad she put the amendment. But to be honest, the credit goes to the struggles of thousands of women in Northern Ireland and in Britain who have fought for a woman's right to choose for absolutely decades. It was that pressure which was put on MPs, who then put pressure on Theresa May to do the turnaround. But the fact is, women's rights have been in the spotlight. And not just because of what's just happened in those specifics, but you look around and it's still the case in every aspect of life. Women are discriminated against, whether it's equal pay, whether it's sexist institutions, whether every aspect. The commodification, sexual commodification of women's bodies, I've talked about numbers of years, so have many other comrades at Marxism. It is still as raw and vile and foul as it's ever been. And so therefore, on every aspect of life, women are still discriminated against. And really, some of this is passed off as ironic, isn't it? Again, something we've talked about. And it's all, this women's lib stuff, it's also 1970s, you're all equal now. Well, I'm sorry, it is not so 1970s. It's very much, unfortunately, 21st century to have to fight for women's rights. And I tell you what, if anything shows that, it was the election of Donald Trump, wasn't it? Yeah. It really is. We now have the world's biggest superpower, watching him strut around, in Europe this weekend, headed up by a proudly sexist man. Not, this is somebody who calls women's fat ass, pig face, and expresses a sexism, to be honest, that's rarely seen in public life openly, nowadays. Maybe behind closed doors, of course. And he boasts of his sexual assaults and vows to overturn the Roe versus Wade court decision, which has allowed legal abortion in the US since 1973. It's a stark reminder, really, of why we're still fighting. But what's really brilliant is it's not all been one way, because the very threat of the election of Trump and when he was inaugurated has actually created this contradictory force to push back, to resist. And the level of resistance as I've opened the meeting, really of a scale that we have not seen for years. And interestingly, this isn't just tied to the election of Trump. We have seen mobilizations on the question of women's rights, particularly abortion rights, on a scale that we haven't seen before. In Ireland, we'll hear more about this tomorrow, in Poland, and Korea. And, you know, it was interesting. I started writing that book on abortion wars because this year is the 50th anniversary of legalization of abortion here, the 67 Act in October. But actually, you know, it seemed like every month there was some new issue, some new struggle. And actually there feels like changes in the air. It feels like places where abortion has been illegal for such a long time, in the south of Ireland, possibly even in the north, you know, that we have a sense that the time could be changing. And when you look at it, I think that the reaction to Trump's election was people saw that they had elected the most misogynist president, you know, in American history, and they were not going to let it go by without protest. And so therefore you saw the magnificent women's marches across the world. You know, they were the biggest protests collectively in US history within America, but millions protested on every continent right across the world. The biggest outside the US was here in London, of 100,000 people. And it was really popular grassroots explosion of anger, the homemade placards, you know, often funny ones, that sense of grassroots activism, that sense of anger, and veterans of the movement, as well as younger, new people coming into demonstrations who marched in London for the very first time in their lives. It was absolutely tremendous and inspiring. I mean, who would have ever thought that a pink pussy hat would become the symbol of resistance to women's oppression? I certainly would never have predicted that. And those demonstrations in America, alongside the fantastic demonstrations against the Muslim ban at the beginning of the year, really were the perfect antidote to Trump's election. I mean, there was all these think pieces and commentary about, oh my God, we're doomed. How did this ever happen? It's all over now, you know, when Trump got elected before Christmas. But that sense of, it showed that people were prepared to resist. They were not just going to accept it. And so what I want to talk about tonight is really what they revealed about the different political ideas that are around women's rights today, and how we fight and what sort of organisation and struggles we're going to need. Because one of the themes of those demonstrations was, and some of the political ideas, was the need to be intersectional. Now, there is another meeting that goes fully into the detail of intersectionality and what it means. But, you know, a brief nutshell in terms of what people were arguing around the marches was really an understanding that women or any other oppressed group are not a homogenous group that all experience their oppression in exactly the same way. That actually their oppression is affected by race, religion, perhaps their status as citizens, class, etc. And this idea of how different oppressions intersect in a certain individual shapes how they experience their oppression. Now, I don't believe class is just another oppression, but I'll come back to that. But the fact is, intersectional feminism has had a profound impact over a number of years now. It's a move away from identity politics, from actually quite divisive politics, to something that is more inclusive. And that sense of also an acknowledgement, really, that all women don't just have everything in common just because they're women. And that sense also, it's not only, but then that means it's a trajectory away from some separatism that we have seen in past years from many activists, but it also is an acknowledgement, at the very least, that patriarchy isn't sufficient as a theory to understand women's oppression, but also that in some ways, perhaps, it actually doesn't, you know, it's failed in that. But that's the strength of that approach. There are weaknesses. And one of them is really that the multiple sources of all these different repressions are seen almost like a star coming at you from all these different directions. And the individual is a single place where they're expressed or experienced. And in contrast, as Marxists, as socialists, we always say that actually the different oppressions that we experience are systemic. They're rooted in the system. They are rooted in something that they all flow from the same roots. To be expressed in different ways, rooted in the very structures of capitalism. And therefore, you know, there also is acknowledgement of this, by the way. This isn't something that intersectional feminists and others reject. There is a term people use is kyriarchy, which is in some sense acknowledging that there's lots of different oppressions. But I think that's avoiding talking about capitalism, you know, because in the end, I think it is rooted in capitalism. But it's worth sort of being familiar with these words, because I wasn't until recently. But the thing is, I think these are useful debates. I think there is much common ground with activists coming into politics in recent years. I think we've seen it, we've experienced it on the streets, but even in terms of the ideas. And when you look at it, I mean, I talked about intersectionality, being an inclusive set of politics. It's funny, some on the right try to use that about the women's marches. And you've got anti-abortion women saying, well, you're not really being inclusive because we're not welcome on the women's marches. Well, too right they're not, because actually they want to argue against women's rights. But you can see how the right was trying to turn it around, saying, well, you say you're so inclusive, how come we are not welcome? But some of the arguments pre the women's marches were more serious, and many of them are around racism. And actually, you got a sense where some white women were complaining on message boards and everything else, saying, oh, we're not welcome, because we're accused of being racist and everything else. Now, some of them just were out-and-out bigots and racists, who didn't like being called out on their racism. But also, some of it reflected the moralism that can come from a privilege theory approach, again, which will be explored in more detail over the weekend, but which actually says just by having white skin, that you are in some way privileged, that you are inherently going to be oppressive to others, and therefore, your presence on a demonstration will actually be oppressive to black and other minority ethnic people. And therefore that sense of, that can be a real dead end, I believe, because it means that you're intrinsic to you. You're never going to be able to battle against racism. You're never going to be able to fight. Struggle can't change this. But these are the sorts of ideas that can grow. Now, to be honest, having that idea about racism in America is not a surprise. Racism is so deeply entrenched it's in the DNA of the structures of US capitalism, racism. So it's, no wonder that that's where the tension comes out. But I think that we have to look at actually how do we want to build struggles, in the future that can challenge the system. How do we build unity, a principled unity, so that we can build a struggle that can actually maximize our organization and the power of our side and overcome divisions. And the first thing I think we learn from this is that a march for women's rights isn't simply about getting women on the streets. Otherwise, all those anti-abortion women would have been welcome. It's actually about getting people on the streets who believe in women's rights, all of them. And that's actually what lots of those women's marches did. That's what made them so successful. But the other question is, where are they going politically and actively? Where are they going? What's the political direction? What politics are shaping them? Where does it go from there? Now, in some places, they're having what people are calling huddles, which are grassroots, local, people meet in people's homes and community centres and talk about local issues and all the rest of it. All that's well and good and better than what was happening before, but a sense of it's not cohesive together necessarily. And what was quite alarming in a way was when you looked at some of the, I wasn't there, unfortunately I was watching this, watching the speeches. The speeches on the Women's March in Washington in particular, with the main one, were really many of the celebrities and political leaders that spoke talked about the need for activists to get inside the Democratic Party and change it from within. And you felt like screaming, like, no! The democratic machine is part of the problem, not part of the solution. The democratic machine brought us Donald Trump. And remember, the Americans just didn't just get Donald Trump. We all got Donald Trump. It has an impact on the whole globe. And so they were the reason we got it. And Hillary Clinton really ought to have been able to beat Donald Trump, shouldn't she? I mean, it should have been a slam dunk to beat somebody like him. And I just wanted to examine some of the background to this, because really the politics that Hillary Clinton used to try and beat Donald Trump, tried to use feminist sort of arguments about women's rights in order for people to vote for her. She talked about we needed a revolution. Well, we do, but not the sort she was talking about, because she was talking about getting the first woman in the White House, breaking that glass ceiling, and all the rest of it. And actually, you think about it, for most women in America, is that really their biggest concern? They're thinking about police brutality, health insurance, abortion rights, unemployment, minimum wage, you name it. These are the issues that really affected most Americans, and yet these were the issues that Clinton did not address. By the way, Bernie Sanders, who was challenging her initially for candidate, did address those issues. The fact was, Clinton was a neoliberal warmonger, part of the political elites, and you had a situation where being called upon to vote for her because she was a woman was something that people rejected. I mean, some of you will know the name Madeleine Albright. Now, Madeleine Albright said there's a special place in hell for women who don't support women, which she was supporting Hillary Clinton against Sanders. And younger women supporting Bernie Sanders says, I don't vote with my uterus. They're saying basically Bernie Sanders is going to address, issues of women's equality and women's rights more than Hillary Clinton was. And really, to be honest, there's a special place in hell for Madeleine Albright, isn't there? Because we take no lessons from her. I mean, again, some of you in the room will remember what she said back in 1996 when she was asked, because she, as Secretary of State, was imposing sanctions on Iraq, and let's remember, you know, things didn't start with, you know, 9/11. Things started long before in terms of how people had been treated in the Middle East by the West and by America. She was told that actually 500,000 children had died under these sanctions by the US, and that was more children that died in Hiroshima, and was the price worth it? And Madeleine Albright replied, "We think the price is worth it." So with women like that and arguments like that, no wonder Hillary Clinton lost. But I think we have to, you know, look at this, because it's not just to mock her, it's to show that when the ruling class women try to use arguments about women's rights and women's equality, it's only to pursue and maintain their own power in a deeply unequal society. Because the other parts of inequality in society they're not interested in. She just wanted to be president in the White House. It wasn't about uplifting everybody else. I mean, in fact, a couple of days ago, I don't know if people saw it, The Guardian ran a piece saying, if women ruled the world. Did anybody see it? I mean, interestingly, I think 20 years ago, everybody would have said, the world will be a better place, you know, it'll be peaceful and everything else. There were some women who said that. You know, women will think more about sustainability, there'll be less violence, you know, because we're all so lovely and cuddly. But actually, many women said, no, we think there's plenty of women, who are in charge who will be damaging. And quite right, because we don't need to speculate anymore, do we? It isn't really like the 1960s. We don't need to speculate about what the world would look like with women leaders. Look around. We've got plenty of them. We have a fascist, Marine Le Pen, who's leader of the FN in France. We have our own Theresa May, the woman who concocted one of the most vile policies about the welfare state, what's been deemed the rape clause, that you can't get benefit for a third child unless you can prove to officials that have got nothing to do with the police or medical care or psychological care that you've actually been raped. I mean, I don't know how somebody ever thought that up, but this is what exists in Britain today, even in Northern Ireland, where, by the way, you're not allowed to have an abortion. And that sense of, there's Merkel as well, isn't there? Angela Merkel, who voted against equal marriage last week. And of course, there's our friend, Arlene Foster, who's really dedicated to breaking women's rights, isn't she? Leader of the DUP. I mean, some people call the DUP Neanderthals. I actually think that's doing a disservice to Neanderthals, because when I was writing this book and read about them, and talking about the evolution of society and everything else, they actually displayed a great degree of gender equality, as it happens. So that's one thing to remember when you're trying to insult people who are backward on women's rights. But what we keep coming back to then, in terms of the problems with some approaches to fight women's rights, is the most fundamental divide in society is not gender. The most fundamental divide in society is actually class. It shapes every aspect of our lives. How long we live, where we live, what our education is, what jobs we get, what illnesses we might get. Class shapes every aspect of our lives. And really, this is not just something about capitalism. This is over thousands of years of class society, and out of which the development of class society developed the institution of the family, which then shaped women's oppression from that very day. And every aspect of class society, if you can't understand women's oppression without reference to class. I mean, you've got the Women's Equality Party. Well, that sounds pretty like, okay, we're all for women's equality. But, when you look at the reality at their conference, when people will know Jack Monroe, who used to be a cookery writer, but a campaigner now, and they talked about what it was like to live in poor housing and being homeless and poor and everything else. And somebody pops up from the audience and says, well, I'm a woman, I'm a landlord, I want the right to evict tenants if they don't pay the rent, or etc. That's what happens if you just think, I'm going to have a women's equality party and we've all got things in common. It doesn't work, because actually they don't have things more in common. But I think the problem that sometimes the approach to class in current debates is there's no recognition, first of all, of how class does shape everything, but also, more importantly almost, is the contradiction about class in capitalism. That being part of the exploited class is not just about more suffering, a greater burden. It also gives us collective power. And that's a contradiction that's absolutely vital, isn't it, if we're looking to talk about how can we fight back. And, this Marxist analysis of how we look at things is actually something that's not the common sense of people who go out and fight about women's rights at the moment. You really don't have a sense of that. It's something that is a minority sport for some. And I think partly it's because of people's experience. And I think that when you look at it, particularly the family, you see, it may feel like it's old-fashioned. We've got such fluidity now. There's so many different families. People live in different ways. We have equal marriage. Yes, that's right, but that's because it's such an adaptable institution, but it still serves the same ideological and economic role in society. In fact, post-recession, post-crisis, it plays that role even more solidly. Every cut in the welfare state, every public sector job gone, this is a burden put more on the family. And for the family, read working class family. And for the working class family, read working class women. That's what happens, and that's how the ruling class use it. Every single time some form of the family is the centre of provision, and women are still told today, that's what the ideology does, is that even if they work, most women do, that actually the domestic responsibility is still her responsibility. And when I say that this is something, that for many people, isn't necessarily the front of their mind when they think of women's oppression in terms of equal pay in the family and stuff, it's because maybe for new generations of political activists, a certain generation really, it's not what their immediate experience of sexism and oppression is. Mostly their experience is what I described at the beginning: sexism, oppression, harassment, the raunch culture. These are things, and now increasingly actually the issue of reproductive rights and abortion, but these are the things that feel that are the most sort of the most thing that in front of them that they see as women's oppression. So that not only drives the struggles we've seen, but it also drives the political ideas that become the dominant ones amongst people fighting against women's oppression. Now, sometimes when we talk about these different ideas, particularly leading up to the women's marches this year, people have talked about the different waves of feminism, and sometimes people joke, oh, I've lost track. What wave are we in now? Is it the 6th wave or the 5th wave? Well, waves are useful in a way to a point, but there's lots of overlap, there's lots of blurring. There's still people who think of themselves and identify as second-wave feminists from the 60s and 70s. In fact, there's probably some of you in this room. So even though we've gone through a number of waves since then, this thing isn't something that's set in stone. And there can be a sort of glorifying of the past movements for women, that it was all united, we were all on the same page, there was no divisions, there was no difficulties, no arguments. Well, really, this is not the truth at all. But it's also true to say the material conditions out of which previous movements have arose have actually shaped the movements in a different way than what would be happening today. So, for example, what's seen as the first wave, which is the fight for the vote, suffrage, you did see a very united movement at the beginning, because ruling class and rich women were also denied the vote. They were forced to fight alongside working class women and other women. But the situation came very quickly. Once some of them had got the vote after the First World War, a layer of middle class and upper class women got the vote, well, then broke away very quickly. Working class women who before the war realized that their husbands and brothers and sons didn't have the vote either. It wasn't just women who didn't have the vote, it was poor working class men. You see the tensions there. Actually, even when it came to America, there was, a demonstration in America where black women in 1913 were told to march at the back of a suffrage march. So the divisions of society came through, even in times where actually there was a material sort of reality pushing them to unity, that the divisions that I've pointed to arose. When it came to the second wave, which is often seen as the high point for women's movements and struggle for liberation, really, it's characterised now as a movement of white middle-class women. Now, there's an element of truth to this, because many of the people who led and were key to the women's movement in America came out of universities and colleges, and people who were wanting to have better education, access to jobs, and all the rest of it. Interestingly, and I write about this in some detail, many of the people who founded the women's liberation movement were from communist and left-wing family backgrounds. So they grew up in a political milieu which made them think they deserved equality. I always think that's an interesting thing, that gave birth to a women's liberation movement. But that sense of, it was a narrow layer of society is absolutely true. And intersectionality is a reaction to that. Intersectionality is, you used to care just about white women, but now we care about all women, and it is a more inclusive from that point of view. But also, we don't want to belittle the second wave, because actually it inspired millions of women, to say, demand their rights, equality, recognition, to be able to get jobs and education, and to be able to control their bodies. So we have to see the contradictions in where there was unity, but where there wasn't, and a sense of what it meant. I mean, in Britain it was a bit different, well, quite different. The material background was a much stronger labour movement, trade unions, a revolutionary left, a Labour Party, and actually, so the women's movement here was always more rooted in class and left-wing politics than the movement in America. But even that past its peak, if you like, fragmented with arguments about imperialism, sexuality, class, and race. And so you saw the movements go down. So when we ask, is this a new movement today? I think we have to look and say there are a number of struggles, some of them militant and inspiring and enthusiastic and imaginative. But do they look like movements that we've seen before? The civil rights movement, the anti-apartheid movement, the anti-war movement? Because everybody talks about movements in a sort of glib way, but I think if we're really genuinely trying to assess what's going on, and I think right now, I don't think you can say that it does. I think you have to say that it doesn't look like those movements. That's not to denigrate the struggle that's going on. And things can change and evolve, so it's not a static situation we're talking about right now. It's not to denigrate it because they are magnificent, but we have to try and understand what constitutes a movement in terms of cohesive action, common purpose and goals, and lasting organisation and impact. And at the moment, that is not what we're looking at. And also, I think it's important to keep coming back to the objective situation for women today is different than it was in the 1960s and different, utterly different to what it was 100 years ago. So any movement for women's rights is going to look very different. It's not the case now that ruling class and middle class women are denied the basic right to not get a bank loan without their husband and, these sorts of things, or not get a job when they're married. I always refer to my mum who had to leave her job in a bank in Northern Ireland because they wouldn't employ married women. You were meant to be kept by your husband. These are the sort of things people faced in the past. Those arguments, those issues have been won, so there's a layer of women who have no interest in getting involved in a struggle for women's rights because they've got as much equality with their class that they want at the moment. Now, they still suffer sexism and discrimination, don't get me wrong, but the fact is they have got benefits from society as it's currently organised that they want to maintain. What's that? 10? Yeah. And so that situation means it looks different. So if a layer of women are not being denied basic legal equality, they have almost been, if you like, being bought off by the system and are locked into it. Therefore, you're looking at a movement today which will be much more based on the working class, on the majority, fighting together, than we might have seen to have cross-class unity over demands like the vote and access to education and jobs and the like. And also, when you look at it today, we've seen a lot of beneficiaries of that side. Many of the Labour politicians, many of the ones attacking Corbyn. They are the beneficiaries of struggles, militant struggles of the past. Bosses in the public sector, in the private sector, people who run institutions. These are the beneficiaries. And of course, I want to see more women in every layer of society. I want more women bosses and judges, to be honest. I want women to be across the whole of society. It's not right that only one Supreme Court that's a woman. But I don't have illusions that just when that happens, that suddenly it's going to be a lovely society with no wars or imperialism or anything else. That would just be basic gender equality, wouldn't it, if women were across? And that's what we want. But we have to then say that it isn't enough. And I think also, when you look at today, it isn't the case that even the women who are fighting for women's liberation today have got unity of purpose and goals and political understanding of what's going on. There are some fundamental fault lines amongst many women who are involved in the struggles today. I get that I'm on the exec of abortion rights, and we get some of them there. Particularly, for instance, the arguments about trans rights, the rights of trans women. There are a layer of feminists, some of them second wave, who find themselves on the wrong side on this, who dismiss transphobia, who want to exclude trans women from women-only events. Something I'm very proud that the SWP has been clear on from the start and stood strongly in opposition to transphobia. I think it's absolutely vital that we take that position. But this is something that's quite mainstream. Obviously German Greer people talk about, but so mainstream that awful Jenny Murray from the Women's Hour started saying, oh, they're not really women. They don't really understand, how did she put it? They don't really understand the history of feminist struggles. Oh, I'm sorry, you're only a woman if you've read these particular books and you succumb to a certain political theory. Well, we're going to lose half the population on that definition. But, that idea that there's more demanded of trans women than you demand of non-trans women is something that I think we fundamentally reject. But another division, there's numerous ones, but I'm just going to give you a couple. It's more relevant in France, but I think it's worth pointing at because we can see similarities and differences. And that is on the question of Islamophobia. Because actually, when you look at what's happened in France, when you have seen leading feminists actually support state bans on children, on girls wearing the hijab in public schools, or on wearing the niqab in public and women facing fines, I think you have to say, this is no form of women's rights. What liberation is it for the state to tell women what they should and shouldn't wear? This isn't part of our politics and shouldn't ever be. And I think that sense of... these examples should show to us that really the idea that we're going to go straight into some new united women's movement on the issue of women is something that isn't straightforward at all. And if you look at it, there's other aspects of arguments that there is about prostitution and everything else, and I don't have time to go through them, and there'll be plenty of opportunities for this. But I think that's what we have to understand. There are fault lines, there are divisions, and actually, as socialists, we stand alongside people who have all of these different positions at different times on issues that we're all fighting together. We unite for abortion rights, we unite against sexism, we unite against the DUP deal, etc. But of course, then among us, we will have differences about how do you fight, who do you stand with, and taking a principled position against all oppression is something that is absolutely important. But just in conclusion, you see, I think if we're talking about is this a new movement, I think we have to say, if you want to fight for women's rights, we're going to need more than a women's movement, a movement of women. We're going to need a movement of our class. Because when I said that, the difficulty was that we have a situation for a generation, in fact, probably a couple of generations of activists today have never seen our class out in a mass struggle, out in a struggle that can take on the ruling class. I mean, I got political joined the SWP during the miners' strike of 84-85. It was defeated, but oh boy, you got a sense of the working class potential because you saw it out there fighting. Actually today, we have been through years where industrial struggle has been at an all-time low, and this affects people's idea, or even their idea to be able to imagine how working class struggle would look. And I can understand that. That's partly why people don't see necessarily class always in the way that we understand it, because they don't see the potential, because they've never seen it in their real experience. And actually, shame on the union leaders who have time after time after time not led a struggle against austerity and a fight, because what happened with the election shows that people want to oppose austerity. They want to tax the rich. They want to defend the welfare state. But time after time, and actually we're talking about a section of society, women are 50% of the working class now in Britain and America. We are. This isn't me saying, oh, the working class is strong, it can come and save us weak women, rescue us from the Tower or something. This is us fighting for our rights alongside working class men against the ruling class women and men who want to deny that to us. And I think this sort of struggle locates our liberation in relation to the system, not just in relation to men. And I think that's vital, because it's the system that creates oppression. It's the system that creates the inequality in our society. And it's the system that ultimately we're going to have to fight and beat if we're going to get rid of women's oppression permanently. And therefore, it's within our power to do this. It's within our power using our collective power as a working class. It's more powerful than anything. That's what the ruling class is the most terrified of. Why do they keep on piling on laws against the trade unions if they weren't terrified of the power of the working class? If they were really the dinosaurs that they keep saying, they wouldn't bother with the laws. Because they'd say, oh, you're weak and you're irrelevant and nobody cares about you. They don't do that. They put in loads of laws because they don't want workers to fight. But we know that when the working class does move, and let's not, the working class will fight because that's intrinsic to capitalism. You have a minority exploiting the majority. Class struggle is endemic, intrinsic. It's part of the dynamic of capitalism. When the class goes into struggle, we know it can move mountains. And we don't know what might spark it. There's a volatility around at the moment, do we? We don't know what can spark it. But there's a political level at the moment, which we haven't seen for a long time. But when the class can move, it can lift everybody. And it can completely reshape people's political priorities and understanding of the world and how to change it. And what is wonderful at the moment, we're not going to sit back and wait for this moment when the class will rise. We want to make the most of every opportunity. And at the moment, there's massive political opportunities for us, isn't it? I mean, it's been tremendous, hasn't it, since the election turned, and what happened with the success. That the person who supposedly lost is the person, all of us going around like that, and the person who supposedly won is a broken prime minister. And I think what's fantastic is that Corbyn's success and the success of a left-wing manifesto has given hope and confidence to our side. It's put a lift in our step, hasn't it? It's made us think things are possible. And actually, the other thing is, it's put the ideas of socialism, their common currency, nationalisation, taxing the rich, being against the war. These are things that people talk about at the bus stop, in the workplace, in the canteen. These are things that are common sense for working class people. And that is a massive opportunity for us as socialists. And the other thing to remember is, not only is the left bigger and more confident at the moment, the Tories are weak. When I described that U-turn about abortion rights for women, let's remember, they fought like dogs not to have that happen. And then on a turn of a penny, there it went when she thought she was going to lose. That's how weak they are. We should be taking advantage of it. And so that victory, that little victory, but material nonetheless, we want to fight for women in Northern Ireland, but it still makes a material difference to people from the day it happened, because the clinic said they were going to give the abortions free. It shows that we can win victories even within the system as it is. But what we, as socialists and Marxists, want to do, we want to say, we want to make the most of those victories. We relish those victories. But we've got so much more to fight for, haven't we? We don't want to just win little reforms when they're weak, and then they'll come back and bite them back from us, won't they, when they're strong. We want more fundamental change. And here at Marxism, that's what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about how can we fight to build an organisation in our class that can actually fight for an alternative to the whole system. An alternative to exploitation and oppression, an alternative to capitalism. That's a socialist society that has, where women's oppression, homophobia, racism go into the dustbin of history. And any socialist society, the one that we're fighting for in the SWP, will have women's liberation at the heart of it. And that's what we're fighting for today and tomorrow. And I hope that this weekend you're going to be galvanised by this, that the opportunities we've got out there to fight are enormous. And I really do feel more optimistic tonight than perhaps for a long time in terms of the possibilities we have for really fighting and winning women's liberation and self-emancipation.
Very high. Let's see what I've written. Yeah, I agree with everything that Judith said. I think she's made a number of really, really important points. One of the things I sort of wanted to emphasise is I think you can't say enough how much austerity really lays bare the women's oppression in this society. I mean, Judith talked about the rape clause, and that kind of got me thinking about back many years ago when I was a new mum, and I was a single mum at the time. And back in those days, we had this thing called the Child Support Agency. And me and all my friends who had young babies, with all the women that we used to sit with each other in the baby clinic and chat. We were all single parents. We all lived on an estate in Kilburn in West London. We were all called in, and we all ended up sitting in that row in the social. And we all had to go, and we were all interviewed and questioned about who our babies' fathers were, about how we'd come about these babies. And we all told them, we'd all sat and talked about it, we all told them a load of lies, because actually we knew that the men who had fathered our babies couldn't afford to support them, so there's absolutely no point in going after them. And off we went, and the state carried on having to pay for our babies. But again and again, actually we were going in and talking to a member of the state about how our babies were conceived, and that like the rape clause, that kind of way that our bodies and our intimate details of our lives, our public property, is a function of that austerity, and it's a function of the way that women are oppressed in this society. And that's particularly true of young and working class women, which is, I'm not so young anymore, but still working class. But the other thing I was going to say, again, agreeing with what Judith said, is about, the number of women that are in work now is absolutely outstanding. And I'm a teacher now, I'm no longer stuck in a council flat with a young child. And I went to a NUT conference this year, and I know I've seen there's other people here who went. And one of the things that really stood out for me, because I haven't actually been able to go to the conference before because of caring for kids, but it was the first time, was about the kind of mood of sheer solidarity at that conference, because we are an overwhelmingly female union, and I think that matters. I think that actually does make a difference. And one of the questions of solidarity was actually about trans solidarity, and about supporting the right of trans people to self-identify and decide, and actually say to people that openly, as a union, as an institution, or a working class institution, that we recognise people have the right to decide what their gender is. That's not something that can be imposed upon them from outside. And that was, I think, a real victory, that it went against a lot of the people who are actually at the top of the union from below, of just a membership saying, no, we stand in solidarity with people, actually, we think it's their right. One more point I was going to say. Yeah, and also, actually, interestingly, one of the people that called the women's demo is a member of the NUT. I've been talking to her recently online, and she's an American teacher. And the other thing that's very interesting that's happened recently is that I went with a delegation of other women from the NUT up to Birmingham in a counter demonstration against some really, really nasty anti-abortionists whose slogan is "from conception with no exception." So no exception for rape, no exception for disability, no exception for any of the circumstances that a woman might find herself pregnant under. I think that's, they are extremely nasty people who really, again, feel that women's intimate lives and their bodies are their property and their right to make decisions about. But like I say, I think we've had reason to feel very positive. Yeah, I'll finish there. Because, like I say, more and more, lots and lots of workplaces are very, very female-dominated now. We're out in the workplace and we're setting the agenda inside the unions too.
Hi, Eleanor, who is followed by Jasmine Fisher, please.
Hi, comrades. Well, actually, first off, I wanted to just say, Judith, that was a really good meeting, and it was so good that I wrote about 3 pages before you were even halfway through and had to force myself to stop. But I will stick to the 3 minutes. And I'm sure, actually, that people will identify with me on this, because anyone who tells me, well, you need to just have a sense of humour when they come out with sexist bullshit, I really, really, really want to punch them in the face. I know that's not a massive political analysis, but it's very true. But I also wanted to talk, actually, just that sexism is a massive issue today, and it's really actually encouraging that so many people came to this meeting today after all knackered after a day of Marxism, mostly being in the pub. And I've heard some awful stories from people on campuses, from people in their workplaces. By the way, if you do have stories of your own, please come and talk to me, because actually this stuff needs to get out there. And those are other people's stories, so what I'm going to do is just stick to the one that I experienced. Last year, I was in Durham and I volunteered at a small political bookshop. It was very Corbynista. It was all right. There were 2 older guys who were sort of associated with the Labour Party who always came in. I always thought they were fucking creeps and patronising. I did not know the full extent of it. They never fucking tried it on with me. The thing is, there were kids there who were 17 and 18 volunteering in the bookshop because they were interested in politics. Not until later on did I find out that these 2 old shits were basically telling one of the girls, who was 17 at the time, that she should make a man out of one of the other lads who was 18 at the time. They were using the C word very blatantly. They were talking about their sex lives in front of these kids, making them very uncomfortable. And I found this out in a very casual way. They mentioned it as if it was normal. That was the depressing thing. And first off, they were shocked at my reaction because you can imagine I was not very quiet. And I got absolutely furious, but also they were encouraged by my reaction. I sat the owner of that shop down and had a very, very, very long, very, very serious talk with him, and he was going, yeah, yeah. At the same time, I realised he wouldn't do fucking anything. At the same time, and I just said, look, do I have your backup to basically sort this out? Oh, yeah, that's fine, as long as I don't have to deal with it. I sorted it out. Those 2 guys hate my guts, but you know what? We never heard a fucking word of it again because they were fucking cowards. And you know what? Those kids who were 17 and 18, they felt safe again. But they didn't feel the confidence to challenge it themselves, and they were expected to laugh it off. This is why, when anyone says I should have a sense of humour, I want to punch them. I know I shouldn't because I'll get arrested, but it might be worth it. But what I really like, Judith, I'm really, really looking forward to your book on the abortion wars, because actually it's a massive fight at the minute. It's really massive. But an important thing to remember, abortion is legal.
You need to sum up.
Oh, sorry. But is it accessible? And that is the key thing. Is it accessible on a class issue? If you have no money, you cannot access it. And you know what? In those circumstances, people die. Abortion, every time it's been banned, it has not stopped. It's only safe abortions that have been stopped. I'll stop there.
Thank you. After Jasmine, it's Mary Littlefield, I think that is.
Yeah, I guess we just firstly start off, just to show, an example of how, as we all know, it's still very backwards, still very sexist today. We've definitely got a fight on our hands. A few years ago, I had to work a job because I couldn't get any other job when I first moved to England. I had to get a job working in a bar where I had to wear a lederhosen, and it barely covered my butt. And I came out on my first shift wearing tights, and they said to me, you can't wear tights, you've got to go back and take your tights off. This is the thing, right? And that job still exists. And Theresa May calls herself a feminist. Why does that job still exist? Why do women still have to work that job? And I think that's the question, really. And, actually, I thought that's something that we just had to put up with. Oh, well, you just have to do that job. Sometimes hard things happen to you when you're a woman. But actually, that's not what made me political. Became political over the minimum wage. I was outraged of working, 40 hours a week and not making ends meet. And then through that, actually, learning about a different way of organising society, learning about the system I live in, I realised actually about my own oppression. I realised that I don't have to put up with it, and I can challenge it, and I can fight back. And all it takes is actually for left to be organised and for us to be united. And actually, we don't have to put up with people telling us what to wear. We don't have to put up with people telling us what to do with our bodies. And I think that's just something really important to remember. And actually, you think, for me, what's inspired me is the story, and actually keeps me fighting and realising that the fight is possible, is looking back at stories like revolutionaries like Alexandra Kollontai, to name the Rosa Luxemburg, like these women actually who were at the forefront of the fight. And actually, although society tries to tell us that we're not able to lead, or all this crap, actually, you see women in the movement for the Egypt Revolution, the Russian Revolution. Women are always at the forefront, and we have to remember that. And so, when we're part of this struggle at the moment, actually, to see the left, becoming much bigger. There's hope around the movement around Corbyn. We have to remember that actually, women can be at the forefront of this, and we can beat back the oppression. We can win this.
Following Mary, it's Emma Davis.
I want to just start with a story. I was on holiday with my niece a couple of weeks ago, and she's 32, and we were sitting around the pool, and I just thought, I wonder what she's reading. And it was Everyday Sexism. And I thought, that's good, because actually I wanted to talk about the difference maybe between older women and younger women and their experiences in Britain. I mean, I didn't realise I was part of a second wave, because I became, a socialist feminist, an activist in the 70s. And actually listening to some of the younger women in this hall today talking about their experiences, it's really quite interesting for me, because it's kind of like I've gone through all that. I went there, I had the T-shirt. You kind of think in 2017 that shouldn't be happening, but it is. So when you talk about those experiences coming back again, I do think there is a little bit of difference between the experiences of younger women today and the experiences of women like me who've kind of been there and maybe have got, maybe not necessarily more resilience, that's not true, but these experiences are different. And I think one of the things is, if you look at women in the struggle today in Britain, there are lots of them. The class is definitely back on the agenda when you talk about the struggles of teaching assistants, of women who are fighting against cuts in mental health services, in campaigns I'm in. The majority of the people on the committees I'm in are women, and they're fighting the effects of austerity very strongly together, and with other men and anyone. It's a very much the idea is that our unity is our class unity against austerity. And in that situation, those divisions, really, you can't see them, actually. People are very much together, and we have one aim and one agenda. But I think one of the things Judith said is that actually it is difficult today, in the sense that, not difficult, but there isn't a common, you could say of the women's movement in the 70s, we had an agenda, we had a common purpose. I don't think that's necessarily so true today. And I do think there is, like I say, there is a little bit of difference between the experiences of older women and younger women. I mean, we've been in unions. You're talking, younger women today have actually spoken about the fact they work in bars and places where they have to wear terrible clothing. Then, their experience of sexism is it's very sexual in lots of ways, in the sense it's about what you wear, what you do with your body. It's going to a festival and actually worrying about getting raped, not just having a good time. There are those experiences that are absolutely horrible. And it's really, really interesting. And it's just fascinating to see that actually in Marxism, one of the great things is that there are women and men of all ages here. And I think that's a really good thing for the future. We can learn from each other. We can talk about our experiences. But actually, it's austerity, it's the Tories that are bringing us together in a common struggle. And I think we can learn from each other. I need to learn how to relive those experiences of taking some bastard on when they make a bloody comment, which I haven't done for years, because I haven't really thought about it for a long time. You don't think about it. But for younger women, that's a real issue. And we have to work together and learn from each other. And I think time is really... It's good. It's going to be good. And we can actually do it. And class is definitely back on the agenda, and that's what unites us.
Emma's going to be followed by Sheila McGregor.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to thank Judith as well for a fantastic talk. And then I really want to start with where the former speaker just left off about class being back on the agenda again, because I really feel like the veil has been lifted at the moment, that in some way women have got it. That's gone. And people have already talked a lot about brunch culture, everyday sexism, and I missed the beginning of the talk, sorry, but the Metro this morning, people, I'm sure maybe that was mentioned, you know, about this woman who apparently lied about rape and so on. Why does that need to be the headline story? You know, it's the Tories and the ruling class are absolutely thinking we need to try to whip up sexism, we need to try to divide the working class, because the key issue of austerity and the fact that people are uniting around fighting back against austerity, they're aware that that's a real genuine threat. And I think that austerity and the economic crisis, through the attacks on social care, education, pay, and so on, abortion rights now, that has really created a situation where there is really no argument for saying that working class women have any sort of sense of unity with the likes of Theresa May. And I think although when she's attacked in a sexist way over her dress and so on, we have to stand up and say that that is sexism. At the end of the day, whose hand is she holding? You know, and I don't think that the ruling class can really get away with that. And I think as well with the women's marches, I absolutely celebrate the women's marches. I think it's absolutely brilliant, but we have to be very clear as well. The reason why people went on those women's marches I didn't go on that because I was a woman, per se. I'm against the attacks on abortion rights, but also Trump is a racist. He's attacking the working class. Actually, the movement against Trump and the movement against austerity is a movement which is about women and about fighting sexism, but it's also about fighting all forms of oppression, actually, and it's also about taking on the ruling class. So I think last night, the opening rally, maybe she's here, a fantastic lecturer spoke from Scotland about her experience of going out on strike, and she said, look, I'm just an ordinary woman, but actually the experience of going out on strike and becoming a leader means that now I'm speaking to thousands of people in a room, and that is what has, you know, made me a leader. And that's what Marxism is about. It's about the working class, giving the oppressed and the working class and exploited people a sense of agency. And the current movement is going more in that direction. What we need to make sure is that women's demands and women's issues are a key part of the fight against austerity.
I'd like to start with something that Judy said about things being a bit different in Britain way back in the 1960s, because I only learned that the women's liberation movement was the second wave, 30 years later, because as far as I was concerned, actually the women's liberation movement was about liberation, because it was in the period of 1968 and the working class actually moving in a revolutionary direction, and therefore that generation, and I was part of it, were actually pulled in a revolutionary direction, and the initial texts of analysis of women's oppression were actually about looking at Marx and the analysis of Marxism. Now, I just want to leap to today, because one of the things that I think is so noticeable today, it's not just the women's marches, but actually if you look at struggles, and somebody has already said it, is the extent to which women are part of the leadership, and not just women as such, but the cross-section of the working class, black, white, Muslim, non-Muslim, actually the mixed working class women taking the lead. Do you think of the cleaners at the LSE? You think of the cleaners at Bart's Hospital on the picket lines, a brilliant demonstration just the other day, overwhelmingly dominated by women. You think of the campaign after Grenfell, actually the role in which the women were playing in terms of saying it is not acceptable that we working class people get treated like this. And the other week, because I live on the 21st floor of a tower block, and my response initially to Grenfell was I almost burst into tears, because it brings it really, people jumping out of tower blocks, and I've often wondered, what would I do if our tower block went up? So we put a few notices up in the lifts on the 3 tower blocks on the estate, and people were saying in the lifts, look, we've just been waiting for somebody to do this, and 150 people turned up to our meeting in the local church, and they were overwhelmingly working class women, and they came in saying, we want to be part of organising to do something about the safety in our blocks. And that sense We are not going to be treated that way. It's absolutely urgent, obviously. You know, you've got kids, you're living in a tower block and so on and so forth. But that notion, we want to be part of a campaign and lead in that campaign, is really, really important. But I want to finish with something which I think is also really important that we understand. 50 odd years ago, the women's liberation movement was influenced by the working class, by that level of struggle, by Marxist ideas emerging from it. The key set of ideas which will be shaping people today are actually the ideas of Corbyn in Britain and in other countries, kind of kinds of left reformism. And therefore, the question of the battle of ideas is hugely important, because momentum. The activists behind Corbyn, and a huge number of them are young women as well. And therefore, those debates and discussions, whilst we're marching with people, organising with people, and fighting with people about reform and revolution, about where oppression actually comes from, and why we need revolution, is going to be absolutely crucial if we're going to win this new generation to revolution.
Following Julie will be Pat Clinton.
Sheila's absolutely right. It is absolutely crucial that we win those arguments at the moment. And I've heard that anger is an energy. I make no apologies for being really angry at the moment. And I think we, tap into that class anger is so palpable at the moment. I think you'll be angry too when you realise they can find £300,000 for a statue for Margaret Thatcher in Parliament Square. Isn't that the amount of money it would have taken to make the Grenfell Tower cladding non-flammable? These are the kind of arguments and the kind of discussions that we have to pick up and argue. And they're right to be worried about it being in Parliament Square. Ask the widows of, the people who died on the Belgrano. Ask the partners and the wives of people, the women leading and struggling in the miners' strike. I'd be all over it in 24 hours. They'd have to have 24 hours policing of that statue if it even went up, to be honest. And then Theresa May. Suddenly she can find £1.5 billion, for the DUP, for the homophobic DUP in Northern Ireland to stitch up a deal after a hung parliament. It's actually despicable behaviour. And, people have talked about trans women and the rights of trans women. We absolutely have to fight for trans rights and against transphobia and against divisions in our movement. Almost 50% of young trans people try and commit suicide. That's in a recent Stonewall report, and that's not even new news. That's been around for a long time. So rather than say, no, you can't be part of this movement, rather than say, oh, no, you're not actually, we're going to determine you by gender suddenly, we have to say you're part of this movement, we need you in this movement, you're part of the fight back, and we have to stand in solidarity with those people, because transphobia is rife in society, and the DUP in this government is not going to sort it out. So just to finish, really, on the unity point, because we need unity around breaking the pay deal and just breaking the pay cap. That's where a fight's got to come back. Other people have mentioned that as well. That's where we've got to have a breakthrough. We've got to push our union leaders to do that, and I'll finish on that point. Thank you.
After Pat will be Sarah Ewer.
I wanted to talk a little bit because... God, I'm short. Because Judith mentioned it but didn't have time to go in depth about there's been a lot more questions these days around sex work and sex workers who are overwhelmingly female usually. And as someone who has dabbled in the industry, because it's very hard for me to find regular work, one of the things I'm really glad of today is there's a lot more talk about actually it's organising people as workers. It's getting away from the idea of, oh, is this morally right? Is this morally correct? It's forgetting that actually there's a whole bunch of sex work that's entirely legal. You go down to any dance club, you have a look at cam workers, anyone in any of the porn industry, they're all paying taxes. They're all part of a regular workforce, but there isn't enough sort of, say, unionisation. There isn't enough organisation. And there's a lot of people who, they're not saying, I really enjoy sex work, I want to be in sex work forever. There's people going, no, if I have to be doing this work, I want to have the same rights as any other worker. I want to have the same protections. I want to be able to organise alongside everybody else. And I think that's how we have to look at these conversations. We can't pretend like the sexism isn't there. It isn't a big deal. It is. But at the same time, we have to have people being able to come out and talk as workers about their experiences, about how they want to face these things, and how we can stand alongside them and support them. Thank you.
Sarah will be followed by Sarah will be followed by Jan Nielsen.
Hi. I wanted to say something about the lesson of women's struggle from the Russian Revolution. Because it was working class women who started the Russian Revolution by marching for bread and peace. And that started the movement that brought down the Tsar in the February Revolution. And when you look at women's conditions then, you think, well, to some extent, why did it take so long? You know, what Trotsky called the double burden. But what Trotsky called the double burden is still with us. Women go out to work. As Judith said, 50% of the workforce in Britain and America are women now. So women go out to work, but they then come back and they still do the second shift of work at home. And working class women bear the brunt of family care, so that's care for the elderly, care for small children, and for relatives who are sick or disabled. And what we can see from the Russian Revolution is we know it lost, but what they achieved in such a short time was truly incredible. By 1920, in Petrograd, they had communal restaurants, they had communal laundries and communal childcare, which meant that working women could pick up their children and go and eat in a communal restaurant. You got your washing done collectively. Childcare was done collectively. So single parents were not just struggling alone. And think about what Lucy said. I had the same thing when my child was small, only then they phoned you up and said, where is the father of your child, and all this sort of thing. And I got a little lecture on how, you girls don't understand that these men, they go off and they have these children all over the place, and you don't even know where they are, and they're all married, and all this. And it was quite funny, really, but it was incredible. And sorry, I've gone off at a tangent. And what I wanted to say was that when you look at the Russian Revolution and you look at the depth of struggle and the women's department there that crossed the old Russian Empire, and you look at the photographs there are of women holding banners, demanding liberation and revolutionary change. There are women wearing their best skirt, shirt and hat, and the woman on the other end of the banner is wearing a full burqa. And they are both revolutionaries, and they are both marching for change, and they will not put up with the old world. And that's the kind of revolutionary potential that we can look to and learn from, because we think, nobody should struggle alone, and we don't have to live like this.
Jan's decided she doesn't want to speak, so I've got Sarah next, and if you just give me a second, I've got Lena Jenkins after that.
Yeah, what a year it's been, actually, really. It seems like a very long time ago, but it was a year ago, or just less than a year ago, that I was certainly having arguments with people about whether Hillary Clinton was the answer that we were looking for, and actually whether she was kind of the progressive voice for women, although she obviously has a pretty appalling track record on, everything, actually, but also women as well. That's not to say that obviously we celebrate the result of Trump. After Trump was elected, it was hard not to feel a bit of a sinking pit in your stomach, wasn't it? That someone who was so openly sexist, racist and all the other things, but was so disgusting and misogynistic, who talked about grabbing women by the genitals, who talked about how he would have sex with his daughter if he was sort of able to, that he could be elected to any kind of public office, let alone the presidency. But you know, like Judith has gone through, there's been a kind of a flourishing of resistance, hasn't there, really? I mean, I was also on the Birmingham March for Life. I think abortion has been, you know, and abortion rights has been, you know, the absolute sort of the sharpest fight, in a way, for women this year. I mean, it was against a group who not only oppose abortion, they also oppose contraception, sex education, IVF, and, you know, all sorts of things. So in other words, however they try and cloak it in their kind of, you know, religious talk and things like that, it's absolutely not about the right to life. It's about control, absolutely minute control of women's bodies, you know, and sort of like sexuality and kind of any degree of decision making that they have about their kind of private lives. We've also seen things like the London Irish abortion rights campaign, you know, who are a group of Irish women in London who are organising to help support the efforts of, like, Repeal the Eighth, who are coming up with really amazing and imaginative kind of actions to take place. But we've also got a bit of a cultural reaction too, haven't we? I don't know who's managed to see The Handmaid's Tale that's currently showing on lots of nods. Good. If you haven't seen it, go and watch it. You know, that's about women's control of their bodies, actually, isn't it? I don't think it's a surprise that that book's 30 years old. It's being made today, actually, because women's oppression is being felt so sharply at the moment. So it's been a really amazing year of watching women fight back, actually. I hope everyone managed to get to see the LSE cleaners speak at the opening rally yesterday. Actually, some of the St Bart's cleaners couldn't make it because one of them was actually in labour that day. She was on strike and she also went into labour. I mean, if that's not an amazing example of kind of exploitation and oppression and women fighting back all in one day, I don't know what is. So we want another year of women fighting back. We want another year of women fighting back, because it's not about just where you're coming from, is it, and kind of experiencing that oppression, but it's also about where you're going as well.
So Lena is be followed by Sue Caldwell, who will be the last speaker.
My name is Lisa, not Lena. I come from Belgium, and I wanted to share something with you, and I felt that was the right moment. I saw on internet there's like false solution to rape, like a pill that you put in your drink to see if somebody put the rape drug, or like a knickers that you can't pull down or something like that, like if that was solution to rape. Stupid. And so, yeah, I just wanted to share that because I'm angry that now we still think that we have to take responsibility for this, and the real solution is to teach boys, because majority of rape is from boys. My English is not really good. We need to start teaching boys that when we're asleep or drunk, doesn't mean we give consent. That if we don't say yes or don't say no, it's not consent. If we say no, it's not convince me. If we say no, it's just no. And I feel like it should be something well known now, but I still have those debates with boys in my class. So yeah, I just wanted to share this.
Thank you. Sheila talked about how in the 1960s and 1970s, the ideas that came out of the women's movement were very much shaped and influenced by revolutionary activity that was going on at the time and Marxist politics. And as that declined and people retreated into identity politics, that link was broken. And what you see now, I think Judith is right to say it's not a new women's movement, but what you do see are mass protests back on the agenda, and that large numbers of women are being involved in those protests. But the ideas that are coming out, the political ideas that are coming out, because that link with Marxism has been broken, are still not informed by class and class struggle. And therefore, the ideas around intersectionality and privilege theory actually are not really quite sufficient to help us to explain what's going on or to really have a solution. To take the example of intersectionality and the idea that, you know, these different ideas just intersect. I was at the TUC LGBT+, lots of letters in the name, conference today, and somebody was talking about intersectionality, and they said, if you're not intersectional, don't ask me to, you know, be part of your event, or whatever it was, or help you. You know, you've got to be intersectional. Sounds common sense, doesn't it? But stop and think about it a minute. I'm a member of a group called LGBT Against Islamophobia. If I'm going to walk past a Muslim person who's being beaten up because of Islamophobia, am I going to stop and go, oh, hang on a minute, what's your views on LGBT oppression before I come and help you? See, I think solidarity is a much better way of thinking about what people really mean by intersectionality. Solidarity and inclusivity is a different thing. And the lack of explanation around intersectionality, about how all those things and where they come from, doesn't really help. Again, take the strand around women's oppression of intersectionality and privilege theory, which actually doesn't help. This is where the whole problem comes with the question of trans politics, because, and by the way, the question of privilege theory actually comes with it the idea that men benefit somehow from women's oppression. These are arguments we used to have around patriarchy theory. It's very important that people understand that patriarchy theory is not an adequate theory for fighting. A lot of young activists think patriarchy theory just means women's oppression. Actually, it doesn't. It's an attempt to say there is a driving force in society equivalent to the class struggle where we women have to struggle against men because men benefit from oppressing women. And actually, that's not helpful when it comes to the question around trans politics. It means your explanation of oppression is rooted in biology, and therefore, if you were born with a penis, you cannot be a real woman, and we are not going to show solidarity and stand with you. Forget non-binary; that goes completely out the window if you're going to have those kinds of politics. I'm just doing a little plug for my meeting tomorrow on gender and trans politics, by the way. But it's very, very important because, you know, listening to some of the things young women are talking about now is actually heartbreaking that people have to put up with that. And I've seen it with my daughter growing up. You know, we have to tell people that it is the class struggle that is the real unifier. If you really want to talk about different oppressions coming together, you have to talk about class. And this is what Marxism is. The motto of Marxism is that the emancipation of the working class is the act of the working class. And by fighting together as the tribune of the oppressed, we will throw off all the muck of ages and build a new society. And we have to teach that to the new activists. They will teach us lots of things, by the way, about gender and oppression and so on. But we have to teach them about class.
Right, thanks, folks. I mean, it seems, you know, when Mary was talking about, you know, being of a generation that feels that you fought these struggles, and it does sometimes feel like, you know, here we are again, doesn't it? Here we are again fighting for things that people fought for decades ago. It reminds me of one of the great slogans and one of the placards that a woman from Northern Ireland had when the DUP deal first came out, and she's from Northern Ireland. She had a thing saying, I left there to get away from this shit. And I feel like I'm sort of saying, you know, I joined the party and struggled for all these decades to get away from this shit, but it's still there, but it's reshaped, it's different, it's fluid, it adapts. So it's not the same. You know, when we talk about this idea that you're meant to have a sense of humour, which I think was a very useful thing to put forward, that is a political statement, because actually that is what women are told. Don't be such a sarpus. You know, get with the programme. It's a laugh. Come on, you know. And that idea that we have to laugh at our own oppression, laugh at our own belittlement, at turning ourselves into sexual commodities or whatever it is something that we should fundamentally reject. And I think that when it comes to the fact that there's so much awareness today, I think it's absolutely right that The Handmaid's Tale, you know, the reason it's being made now, and it's so powerful. I mean, at every demonstration, you know, you're seeing in America, even today again, you know, women wearing the red, and it's just so powerful, isn't it? And, you know, I think, well, anyway, I won't talk more about abortion. We've got a panel tomorrow, so let's save it for that. And I hope people will come along to that because, you know, we've got women involved in the struggles, Breed from Ireland and a comrade from Poland as well. But I think this, you know, it becomes symbolic, doesn't it, of something broader than not just about abortion, but about how women are treated. And let's remember, it's not just because abortion is about biology and everything else. It's about fundamentally challenging women's role, the expectations of her to be a mother, to be a family person. And therefore, that's why it becomes so important. And I think to come back to the idea about struggle and class and what sort of politics are going to shape the struggles that we face. You see, I think I talked about the lack of industrial struggle. And I also laid a lot of the blame on the political leadership of the unions, which I think is a disgrace. And many of the things that have suffered the most attacks are on women workers in the public sector. And therefore, we could have seen a very different situation over recent years. But it's interesting that the class consciousness in Britain today, I think, is still tremendously high. This idea, when people talked about Grenfell, I think what happened after Grenfell was nothing less than class rage, both from the people directly involved around the tower, but across the country. Nothing less than class rage. And when I talked about socialist ideas and stuff, or the common sense talked about at the bus stop, people who had just been bereaved and seen people die in their flats were talking about austerity and racism and class and the rich and social cleansing. These were words you wouldn't necessarily have thought would be on the tip of the tongue of people who just seen what had happened and experienced it, but it was. And so therefore Grenfell becomes something that has made people angry. It's got nothing to do with industrial struggle, but at the same time it still taps into, doesn't it? Taps into some of the same issues that Corbyn's election campaign tapped into, in terms of the deep anger and bitterness about what the Tories have been doing to us for years, and how the rich get richer, and meanwhile the rest of us get poorer. And let alone all the following arguments, the layers of arguments about what happens afterwards and all the rest of it. But also I think it's absolutely right, women have been leading that struggle and others. Do you remember when David Cameron said that Muslim women were traditionally submissive? That's not what it looked like to me when they were trying to break in the town hall. It's absolutely fantastic. But this is the thing, because if women get put in a box of being victims, of needing support, needing help, not being able to fight for themselves, that's actually, we are also class fighters. And we are in a position to be powerful class fighters. We're in a better position to take part today than we have been for some time, or forever. And I think that sense of how we fight, because you see, there's a difference. Oppression can fragment us. It can make us feel alienated, isolated. It can make us blame each other. Oppression doesn't necessarily unite us. And I think that sense of actually, sometimes even, particularly with women's oppression, it can be internalized. Oh, I'm just not confident enough. If I just got a bit more confident, then maybe people would listen, or I could speak up or whatever. Actually, no, it's not about your psychology. It's not a psychological state that needs a therapist. It's actually about the structures, how you've been socialized, how you've been brought up, the expectations of you. I always sort of say it's always about the woman has to worry about, has everybody got a cup of tea? Is everybody seated? Is everybody, always trying to think about looking after everybody. That's what you're told, that this is what you naturally should be like. And I think that sense of understanding that oppression can generate mass movements and opposition and struggle, but it can also make you alienated. It can be debilitating. But actually, when it comes to the struggle of us as a class, that's genuine empowerment. You get all these ridiculous adverts about empowerment, cosmetic surgery, it'll empower you. This new lipstick, wearing high heels, this will empower you. What really empowers women is actually being part of a collective struggle that feels they can change the world. And just as a little aside, when Pat talked about sex work and everything else, I think what's interesting, when you talk about even the job of, being told not to wear tights, it's actually the so-called idea of us being sold as sexual objects is a wide range, isn't it? From working in a bar, being told what you can wear or what you can't wear, whether it's dreadful restaurants, it. This isn't just about prostitution. It's a very broad layer of people that would be drawn into what could be called the so-called sex industry. And I think it's absolutely right that any fight that women can have more rights, better protection, because it's particularly when you're at the sharp end, say, of prostitution, it's the most dangerous. The police harassment, they're not there to help you. They're there probably to arrest you, give you a fine, mean you have to go out and earn more money to pay the fine. And that sense of standing alongside women, absolutely, absolutely. And I think that, but when we look at it, when I look at the whole of society, and how I envisage a socialist society where nothing is a commodity. I envisage socialism where food is not a commodity, where people don't starve because they don't have money for food, where water isn't a commodity, that you cannot have access to clean water if you don't have the money, where housing is not a commodity, education, and therefore I believe in a social society our bodies will not be a commodity either. I think this is something that will go not by state diktat, not by imposed from above, but I feel that when we get involved in the sort of mass revolutionary struggles that potentially can change the world, they also change us. They change all of us. And that's the sense, you know, when we talk about how struggle makes us fit to create a socialist society, it actually will change us and make us able to create the sort of society where really the idea that women's bodies or clean water or food was bought and sold to the highest bidder will be something that future generations will look at like we're crazy. You know, how could that be? Why would people treat women like that? Or why would people, you know, and so therefore I think there's both what we fight for today. I mean, we fight for higher wages today. I don't think we should have wages for different jobs in a social society in the long run over a period of time. People will give according to their ability, to each according to their need. But that sense of, you know, I think we have to, you know, the solidarity and fighting alongside together with everybody today, but also having a vision of something that is quite different. And I think that what we're fighting for now is both fighting for ideas to shape the future struggles, but also fighting for organisation. You know, because ideas don't just happen in the ether. Go off and read a book. Do go off and read a book. I'm not going to tell you which ones, but you know, but that sense of, you know, it's also about organisation. It's expressed in an organisation that can fight and lead struggles, that imbues the lessons from the past, who to trust, who not to trust. When the ruling class women use feminist arguments to, you know, impose their power, reject them, they're not our allies. When trade union leaders say, oh no, we better not, you know, reject them. And that sense of actually the, and what revolutionary organisation which we're fighting to build in the SWP, why it's so important is actually, I said class struggle will happen inevitably. Because Marx said that every past class society, you know, it's defined by class struggle. It happens, that's the dynamic. But what's not inevitable is victory. Otherwise, to be honest, we'd all be living in a socialist paradise right now. We wouldn't be having Marxism 2017. We might be having a memorial for the fact we used to have these things, you know, that wanted to challenge the system decades and generations ago. The sense of victory is not inevitable. And what has been lacking in past struggles is not the combativity and the confidence and the enthusiasm of working class people to fight. It's been about the sort of political leadership that says, this is what we fight, here's where we go, don't give up now, we've got them on the run, don't back off, etc. And that's what we're trying to build in the SWP, and I think that's why organisation is key. Organisation with the ideas that can lead fights, that can move us forward to fight. This isn't a sort of utopian dream thing we're talking about, because we fight for everything right now. It matters if the cleaners win. It matters if Grenfell people get justice. It matters, every single struggle matters today. But they also, each of them have got in them a kernel of the possibility and potential for us to fight for something much bigger, for a completely different society. So I hope that any of you who are not yet a member of ours are going to join us tonight or over the weekend, and look forward to a weekend of debate and struggle and go forward for the fight after that. Thank you.